most companies often haven't really done this. They don't really know who to hire, and how to interview. If you just think you want to do something with data, that's a really, really bad reason to hire someone. Even very large companies are really bad actually with data. Really having your data in really good shape, we know drives higher valuations. I found that the more fluffy the question, less it differentiates. And also, you must not tell the candidate kind of in any way what actually response you really expect.
We are live on the Objective Hiring Show with Jan. Jan, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It is our pleasure. I had a chat with you about a month ago, and we spoke about a few different things, and I'm pumped to kind of unpack some of those in today's conversation. Where I'd love to start, though, is if we could get a little bit of an introduction about you. Who is Jan? What are you up to at the moment? Love to kind of contextualize our conversation a little bit.
Yeah, so I'm director for data and AI for a private equity fund in Europe. I'm sitting in London. And so we're operating in the mid-market. And I'm looking after that portfolio of 50-ish companies and drive the value with data. And that involves a lot of hiring and building teams. Sometimes it's more on the actual data side. Sometimes it's more going towards the AI side.
And so you're working with the portfolio companies of the fund, and how intricately involved do you get in hiring? Do you give them kind of strategic advice, like here's the first person you should hire, and then they're the ones who figure out the team? Do you actually get involved in interviewing and the mechanics of hiring?
Yeah, I do get involved. So I'm getting very much involved with the first type of hire, and in most cases, that's a bit more senior hire that will then build the team up, and because most companies often haven't really done this. They don't really know who to hire, how to hire, and how to interview. So I'd be very involved in writing that job description together with the team there, and then doing an interview. When it gets to additional members of the team, I'm leaving that to the portfolio company.
And so you're there in that critical first step of them getting their first, I don't know, head of data analytics, director of data science, that kind of role, is it?
Exactly. That's mostly the type of role that I'm hiring for.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I've spoken to a few data leaders recently, and we were kind of discussing this very conundrum, which is for a lot of companies, maybe those who aren't necessarily VC funded, how do they go about getting their first senior hire? It's kind of a circular problem because the person who would hire that person is almost the person themselves, if that makes sense. So having someone external like you as an expert to come in and help guide that process, I think must be very valuable for them. And if nothing else, is going to prevent them making pretty disastrous errors in making the wrong hire. I imagine that's a lot of the value you're adding to the equation, do you think?
Yes, I mean, like getting the wrong person in is quite disastrous, obviously. And I for often for those companies, and we're talking about mid-market companies, like we're writing check sizes between say like 40 and 400 million pounds. Those companies don't really have there's no one really with a big history of doing those things. So they have two problems. One, they have to first what does this person actually do? Right? Because it's easy to say I want to do something with data or what do something with AI, but what does it actually mean? And how does it really drive value? So I think the most crucial bit is actually writing the proper job description and that scope for the person and what they're driving. And often, actually, before we do the hiring, gonna have contractors in our consultancy already doing a piece of work that then convinces everyone to say, "Oh, we really need that person because now we understand why X and Y works and how they will drive value." Now, once you're very clear on who you need, I think there's an element of a technical interview that is required. So I would be doing that often. But I think the job is 80% done when you know what you need.
That's such a great summary, actually, because yeah, I feel like in my experience, hiring processes that go downhill quickly, a lot of it stems from that initial spec being off, like the right questions not being asked, of kind of fuzziness in the thinking of what exactly you need, which then inevitably leads to what I would call like the moving the goalpost problem, where suddenly you get halfway through the process and some other interviewer comes in and they have their own ideas about what you're looking for, and you're kind of all over the place on the wrong page. So it's interesting to hear you kind of back that up to say, well, yeah, once you've got the clear scope, then as long as you just stick to that, you should be right most of the time.
100%, I so super agree. That's really, really important. And particularly if you then move around also reporting lines and so on, that's really, really bad. You need to know like who holds the pen on this, why you're really doing it, and why it really drives value for you. If you just think you want to do something with data, I think that's a really, really bad reason to hire someone.
And thinking about it now, actually, this process is helping the person who ultimately gets placed there, because they're not, uh, you know, getting into a poison chalice scenario where they've got a vague role where someone expects them to do almost magic because it's AI. You've kind of laid a path for them to have a chance of being successful as well, I guess.
Absolutely, right? And in some ways, that is my role of making sure that those things are successful and actually drive that value and really work. And if I'm getting the wrong person in and have the wrong objective for that, it's also going to fall on my feet. And so it's really, really important to know upfront what you want, because I think there's a lot of value in those hires, and particularly even very large companies are really bad actually with data. But in the mid market, often there's people don't know really how to get started, and so what should we do and why are we doing it is so important, and really helps people to then when they're landed to say, oh yeah, actually I know why I'm here. It's not just, oh, the CEO went to a conference and heard we need more data people.
I'm laughing because that's yeah, such a common scenario. I imagine one of the challenges is because you have quite a large number of portfolio companies, you probably can't, unlike if you're hiring, let's say, into your own business, where you really understand in intricate detail, including down to like a cultural level. It must be hard or impossible to get that level of depth of knowledge over each of your portfolio companies. So is it a case of like knowing enough about them to advise? Is it also a case of really needing them to fill in the gaps of the cultural elements, and you're focusing more on the technical skills needed for the role? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, so the moment we acquire a company, in the first 100 days, we would do like a fair in-depth assessment, actually, right? So you build something called a value creation plan. And then also we do an assessment on what is actually the current data capability, because historically, and I think also looking forward, if you don't have your data in a good shape and actually know what's going on, that can drive underperformance. But likewise, really having your data in really good shape, we know drives higher valuations. So really in the first 100 days, we do quite in-depth assessment of what actually is the real, like, fleshing out the value creation plan for the entire company. What is the current position on the data? And then there's a question about what do we want to achieve with the data function? Do we need to make any changes? And so then we have the discussion with the management who really drives this, really. And that moment, then you make a decision. So it's quite in-depth analysis of every place. Of course, what I can't do is the cultural fit and the chemistry of people, right? Because I'm not the line manager of those. You need the person who's going to hire, and typically those people sit under the CFO in most cases. Um, that person really needs to have the rapport and have the chemistry. So I'm doing more the technical and the why questions, and that's where I'm supporting other than actually hiring them directly for myself. And I think that's a different dynamic, to be honest.
What I love also in your approach is basically part of the solution to this is get more data. Like you're doing that research initially, and then that data you're getting back is then informing the whole process, which is, I think, a nice loop. One thing you mentioned in passing then, which struck a chord with me again because of some conversations I've been having recently, is you said most of these people would end up reporting to the CFO, and I know from some guests I've had on recently, they felt as though sometimes, depending on who you're reporting to, you could be set up for more likelihood of success or failure as an analytics leader. Some of them had bad experiences, in particular, reporting into the finance function. They felt like their role was maybe not what it could have been. Do you have any views over like let's say the top level analytics leader in a business should be reporting to? Ideal world, what's your views on where it should sit?
I think the analytics leader, so when we're talking about KPIs and dashboards and so on, that has to go to the CFO. It's a bit different when we're talking about data science and actually talking about product development or something very specific. But otherwise, the analytics here has to go to the CFO. Why is that? I think there are a couple of reasons. Number one is you need to report someone who's cross-cutting across the entire business. And effectively, they're kind of like two candidates only, right? There's the CFO and the CEO, really. And potential COO, right? Someone who does a lot of operations, but then you might be losing already the sales parts, and that's really, really an important bit. And now the CEO will have to do many reports. This is not a direct C-level report. So it has to go under the CFO. And a good CFO knows what they can get from this. I think if you are going with like a CFO who is more of a glorified accountant, right, and that does exist, then I think you have a problem. But generally, like good CFOs, they see themselves as driving the business, and they sit on the most important data to drive the business, the financial data. So working together with the CFO and being plugged in with the FP&A function is kind of like the success criteria number one. Now, you don't want to, if you're in your reporting hierarchy very far below the CFO, that will be a real issue, because then, of course, you become like someone in the finance function only, and you don't become that cross-cutting person. But if you have a direct report to CFO, you can really do the cross-cutting across the entire different departments and help there.
And for data science, because you made that distinction, it might go into like a CTO kind of role instead, typically, or
Very much depends on the product, right? So if it's a tech company and you're supporting the product, then yes, it will go into CTO. But if you are, say, like an insurer, and we also have that case, then would go into the pricing function, because the key thing in here is to price things better. So it very much depends what actually the real purpose of it is. And maybe if it's more on the marketing side of things, right, it could go very much also into marketing. It very much depends what actually the real purpose again is of that person. And with data science, you typically have a very big, clear use case why you're doing this, not just like a general idea.
the lens you have, I find really interesting because you have this kind of cross sectional view across a similar set of problems for many different companies in many industries, which I think is puts you in like a pretty unique position to be able to kind of compare and contrast. And like, I'd love to hear any insights you have around like most commonly recurring problems that these businesses would have when it comes to like data and data teams. Like if there's anything that just comes up again and again and again that we could share with the audience that would kind of help them in that scenario avoid these kind of common issues you've seen.
Yeah, if you go back to the reporting lines, one thing that sometimes turns up that this data person is reporting into IT, I think that is, if you're very, very strong commercial chief information officer, you're going to be okay. But in most cases, you're not going to be okay. And so you really got to like change that, because basically people get siloed away from the business. And so then they're not plugged into the business. People would then start questioning the value of the function itself, because it doesn't really drive that value, because you're not plugged in the business. You are seeing like that back office bit doing something very fancy, really interesting, but not really additive. So it become cost, right? And I
Right.
think that's one thing that really happens from time to time. I think the other bit that can happen, and this actually not necessarily your direct fault as a data leader, is sometimes the finance function or the FP&A function is actually more of the issue, or you don't have like a revenue function, or no one does pricing, and then you're getting responsibilities for things that you shouldn't have, right? Like financial planning and budgeting. Um, that is like, if someone doesn't really know on the finance side and how they classify different financial things, like say like a downsell. Like if you think about churn, for example, defining churn is quite difficult, because you can lose a complete customer, that's easy, but you can also, the customer is using your product less, maybe you have usage-based pricing, um, maybe the customer is dropping one of the products. So how do you define all those things? And this is really, really important. And then you need those leaders on the other side to help you and define those things. So if this is missing, you have a big problem. And then I think the other bit that happens is sometimes people reinvent the wheel. That's also something we see, where basically people writing very custom pipelines to pull in data, and that takes a lot of time, a lot of maintenance, a lot of focus. You could just get it off the shelf. And again, you have like a big team that is then not seen as driving that commercial impact. So I think those are the things that most commonly go wrong. There's also something around bigger organizations where you need to drive it, basically the entire businesses, um, and sometimes people become a bit more passive than proactive. So I would always encourage people to be very proactive and not go into the worst case scenario, which is a ticket-based system, right? Someone sends you from business, submits a ticket, fix this dashboard. And if you're in this dynamic, that's really not great. You need to become proactive and actually drive why do you need it, what are you changing, and not being on the receiving end of that. People should be able to do that themselves. It's that easy. So lots of things go wrong, to be honest. Right? It's easy to get right. It's also very easy to get wrong.
You'd mentioned one of those being overinvestment on customized solutions. A company I've worked at previously, we had an acronym which stood for NBH, not built here. And it's almost like this mentality that we were going to make everything ourselves, no matter what it was. It's like, it was a company full of software engineers, and it was like a bunch of nails to a bunch of hammers. We were going to code something to make something, even if it was, a new email system where we don't really need it because there's Gmail for free and it's amazing. But we're going to make it. I wonder if that mentality is especially dangerous at the moment because AI is developing so quickly that there's going to be almost, I feel like, this cohort of people who identify as like, I am a coder, I am a statistician, I'm a data scientist, where suddenly maybe the day-to-day things they do is going to drastically change. Like if, for example, in a year, instead of ever writing code from scratch, you prompt an LLM to do it and it does it with 100% accuracy, hypothetically. then associating yourself with the act of coding in your very identity is going to be, I think, a big problem for people. Is this something we're going to have to overthrow? We're going to have to be like particularly adaptable. We're going to have to think about what exactly we're doing and who we are. Have you thought about this kind of challenge?
I think we talk about this reinventing the wheel, and you're doing that already a lot. It's never great, right? I like the Amazon motto of saying build to differentiate. And I think that's always true even now. So if you're doing that right now, I think you're fine. But if it's indeed the boilerplate code that exists already 10,000 times out there, I think there's a risk. I think the big LLM providers are all trying to build two things. One is, I think, the ability to basically control like software very generically. You've seen that with Operator and what Anthropic also has built. So it's just like a program that can click and do some things.
This would be so-called agentic AI.
Agentic, but even more in the sense of that it just takes your computer screen and just can do kind of like very generic things. Not only agentic would also mean you might have to program that very specific for a use case. But I think they're trying to do this. You can generally do things that you and me can do on your computer. And I think the other use case they're going to go for is the software engineering side, right? Like the proper software engineering side. And I think if you're doing something that is done very often, say like a website redesign, I would be worried on that one, because that there's so much code out there on exactly this problem. It's not a very difficult problem, right? If you get a tiny bit wrong, not a big issue in most cases. So that is, if you like in that niche, then you also are probably not super differentiated in what you're doing. And I would think about if you can move into something that's more differentiated.
There's also a sense, excuse me, of adaptability. Like, and in fact, when you're consulting with the portfolio businesses and helping them decide who to hire, are you explicitly looking for like an adaptable kind of person? Just because this is kind of in so many conversations I've had with people recently where there's almost a feeling like the tech is changing so quickly that it will be almost pointless to say, well, let's make sure we've got someone with, I don't know, this particular set of tool experience because they're just changing. So we need to have someone who's very adaptable, can learn a lot of new things quickly, especially if they're coming from another industry. Is that something you would specifically look for?
Yes, I think it's very, very important. I think with almost everyone you hire, you always have to think about that they're going to probably replicate exactly what they've done in the past if they had success with it. Because it's just natural, right? You and me, we did something, we're like, oh, it worked, let's do it again. And I think it's really important to look out and think about who can actually go beyond that and say, maybe I'm not doing again exactly the same thing, but I'm thinking about maybe I'm going to do it differently this time. So I think being adaptable and wanting to learn is one of the most important things in this field. But also, it's always been true, right? So if you look back 5 years ago, or 10 years, or 15 or 20, think about 20 years ago, what software engineering was, or data, completely different, right? Like, anyone remembers Hadoop? I'm not sure, like, not many people. And that's actually not a very old technology. So it's going very, very fast. It's always been, and I think this maybe just increases the pace a tiny bit, but it's not a complete game changer. If you didn't reinvent yourself and you've been in software engineering for last 15 years, then you've got already a problem. Like, Docker didn't exist like 20 years basically ago.
Yes, the rate of change has already been so fast, and it feels like it's getting faster. I'm not sure if there's any particular way to measure this, but that's, I guess, a lot of people's sense. What about when it comes to hiring itself? Do you think that's going to change almost as quickly as anything else? will humans even be doing hiring in 2 years' time? Could it be completely automated by AI? What's your kind of macro view on the use of AI in hiring?
I think it's a difficult question. I think I'm like sometimes it's quite surprising because for the positions I'm hiring, you wouldn't expect that. But sometimes we give people like small assignments, and this is not like assignment in terms of solve this exact problem, but it's more like what would you do in the first 100 days and why. Just more about like how would you think about building a team and all those kind of things. And literally someone sent me said, oh yeah, I don't want to do this in PowerPoint and do like 5 slides. I want to send you like here's a Word file. It was definitely written by ChatGPT. So how do you, obviously we didn't hire that person because it was like also not very good actually what ChatGPT produced on this one. If it was good, I think then there's a legit reason. But I think you need to hire to some extent in person. It's very difficult to not do that. There's going to be a risk that they otherwise just going to talk more or less to the AI. I think we're not there yet, but it's also not very far off. There's quite a big risk on how do you do a skill assessment and so on. So I don't have an exact answer how it's going to change, but I think there are changes coming down the line. I think that's obvious. How? That's a good question. We actually have a couple of portfolio companies that are recruiting companies. And so if you think about differentiation, in many cases, their value is not necessarily the recruiting itself, but there's other value, economic risk they take on, and so on with the process, training of people, and so that is that's really really important because that isolates them against certain changes in the future.
I was a bit dubious of AI for this use case for a while, but then I feel like, I don't know, maybe the last 5 or 6 months, I've found myself being increasingly bullish on at least the state of the AI being good enough to solve a lot of the steps in the hiring process. Now, that is, to be fair, distinct from companies adopting it not being ground down by privacy regulation, it not being ground down by recruitment legislation in some countries. But I feel like we're going to see like a new wave of SaaS products that are SaaS recruitment products that are almost like AI native, that are built on this emerge in the next, I don't know, few months. And that'll be interesting to see once any sizable companies are actually using those, how they get on. Because at the moment, from what I've seen, it's just kind of like, your big applicant tracking systems adding an AI feature here and there, but it's adding a bit of AI dust to a system that's fundamentally built for humans to click shit. Whereas I feel like we're in a new world where there shouldn't be so many humans clicking stuff that's just a glorified SQL database wrapper. I feel like we're maybe emerging into the next era, but we'll see. I feel like one of the big issues with hiring, let me throw this at you, is like, what's the success metric? I don't really have a way to model it to say, well, if someone stays in a company for 10 years, tick or cross. If someone gets promoted, tick or cross. What happens if someone leaves and gets promoted? Is that good or bad? Like, we don't really have that data set that's as obvious or something as equivalent to, like in sports, a number of goals scored, number of assists made. It's very obvious what you're optimizing for. We don't have that for traditional roles. Is that part of the challenge, do you think, of maybe automating the whole thing?
It's definitely one of the issues. I think another issue is probably what we talked early on about this knowing actually why you're hiring and what exactly you're hiring for. So I think sometimes this happens in the conversations, right? That with some candidates where they say, okay, maybe you have to repivot. Shouldn't happen. Sometimes happens. And if you don't really have that exact idea what you want, I think that's very difficult. Like AI is also not necessarily going to solve that for you because it would first have to diagnose what is actually wrong in your company. What do you actually want to change? where do you see actually that added value? So I think it's this piece of what exactly you want. You still have to figure that out. But I mean, generally, I'm very excited for AI to do a lot more screening. I think, particularly the very basic stuff that is like completely obvious from CVs or very short conversations where there's zero bias involved, anyways. So I think that's something that can also get past the regulators. I think when it gets to actual hiring decisions and actually doing some of those interviews, that will be very difficult to do just with AI. And then you got the same problem again. What if you're interviewing another AI on the other side, right?
Yeah, that is going to be the challenge. And I feel like the AI will probably be implemented from the top of the funnel down, just because of that top of the funnels. There's the most number of candidates. You're the earliest in the process, biggest cost. Yeah, a no-brainer, I think, personally, for making it less biased, because at the moment, like when you look at some of the stats around CV screening, like when organizations have done these experiments where they've basically tried to see what kind of biases there are against people from different backgrounds based on their name, the results are pretty catastrophic. Like one in Australia from a couple of years ago had tens of thousands of different CVs in 3 buckets. The buckets were the same as each other except for the names on the CVs. So first bucket had Anglo-Saxon first and last name. Second bucket had an Anglo first name, Chinese last name. Third bucket had Chinese first and last name. They then applied to thousands of different roles around the country, different industries, different seniorities, controlled for many variables in their experiment. And then they measured the rate at which those buckets of CVs got a callback or not. And so for the first bucket, it was, I think, a 12% callback rate. Third bucket, 4% callback rate. And they'd done a pretty good job in their experiment design. So, like, I don't think they missed out any obvious factors that would explain that, other than the name, which is shocking. So, like, I hear a lot of fear mongering or just legitimate fear around AI and some legislation in countries like America preventing automated hiring decisions. But I think if the base case is already so flawed, can't be that much worse than that, surely. And at least with an AI system, in theory, it could be auditable in a very clear way, tracks everything that's done, the decisions it's made, and why. We don't have any of that at the moment with human hiring. So I feel like there's a lot of upside.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of upside in like clear criteria, right? I think what people are afraid of is this machine that might make a decision and no one can really understand why. But as you're saying, I think it's at the top of the funnel where the criteria are very, very clear, right? And the existing systems or the old systems, they just search for keywords and stuff. And that's really, really bad because you have to exactly describe how it is. And a large language model will be able to judge much better. Did she actually say that or not? And maybe you just use different words. But basically, I think the top of the funnel, there's just very hard selection and pre-selection on criteria that very transparent, and that would be in most cases carried out by HR and maybe a first screening manager, but that's kind of like it. And I think this is the low hanging fruit that we should get to. Later on, I think doing probably completely automated hiring is really, really difficult for lots of reasons, but I think top of the funnel would already be worth a lot.
Use recruiters.
Exactly, right?
Right. So you outsource the pain and misery to them.
Exactly.
Well, I'm sure it costs you a pretty penny, though, to do that. So I feel like AI, in theory, could do it a bit more affordably, but we'll see. I feel like, if I think about now, especially with a lot of the people I've spoken to working in very large companies where the talent acquisition function and the hiring team are completely disconnected, they will often report to me that the talent managers that they kind of get assigned almost on a job by job basis and don't have any relationship with, they're not doing a great job at the screening either. Because, to be fair to them, what on earth does the average talent acquisition person know about the the very specifics of a data scientist versus a data engineer role. To them, it's just a bunch of data words. Like it would be, trying to put myself in their shoes, it would be like me trying to hire a lawyer and differentiate between a, I don't know, surveying lawyer and a barrister and or whatever. I have no idea. I just have some words on a CV, and I'd probably try to guess based on like what my mate told me, or now I'd ask ChatGPT or something, but really I'd have no clue. So surely, again, I feel like a large language model could do better than an untrained person trying to select CVs based on a job ad and maybe one conversation they've had with a hiring manager.
Yeah, but it's a general problem, right? So if you think about any type of process automation or doing things with AI, you just don't have those things properly codified. Because if you had for a talent team like a 1,000-page document that exactly described all the different roles in detail and what exactly you needed, and probably that will have to change every year as technology progresses and your organization changes. But if you had that, you wouldn't have that problem in some ways. And so currently, probably like how this more works is it's in people's heads, is talking to your colleague about it. And but if it did that knowledge is not organized and formalized. And so that's a big barrier actually for AI to being implemented, because you need to codify it. And it's the same thing, not only for hiring, but for any type of automation you want to do. So this is the biggest, I think, barrier we currently have, and that people see that they need to fix in their companies.
Yes, and as you say, without having defined what you're looking for and why, doesn't matter if it's an AI trying to search for people or screen people or a human doing it, you've still got the same problem. I wonder if we can maybe automate away enough of the bullshit in hiring that opens up enough time to then actually collate these data and have the conversations we need to have to figure out exactly what we need to hire. And then whatever's doing that hiring, whether it's an AI or a human or a combination, then maybe has a better chance of getting it right if we've actually synthesized some of these data, put it in the right system. Like, for example, so later on the funnel in the interview stage, I feel like, an AI interview assistant that's taking notes and summarizing and maybe pre-filling your evaluation criteria. Like, well, I reckon the candidates, scored a 7 out of 10 on this question. This is the reasons I have. What do you reckon? And then you as an interviewer can kind of do like a last sanity check or something. I feel like that would solve a bunch of time and open up some extra time to do other things maybe. So even if it's not taking care of the entire decision, if it's kind of assisting the human, it could help a lot as well.
I think the interviews would get a lot more structured if you had that, particularly if you had an AI that would say, here's here's a list of all the questions you typically would want to ask on this exact position, and you haven't asked those questions yet. Because if you interview a lot of different candidates, you have to be very, very clear about that you ask people the same questions and make sure that you can differentiate candidates on those questions. Otherwise, what's the point of having that conversation? It's just going to be like then complete gut feel. So you need to be able to compare. And I think an AI will be a good reminder for a lot of people to actually just follow good interviewing practices.
Now, speaking of that, that's probably something that we neglect a little bit, which is just figuring out what to ask the candidate. Like, is there almost like a bit of an art, a bit of a science in crafting a good interview question?
Yeah, I think so. Now I'm more interviewing more senior candidates. I used to interview a lot of people when I used to work for the Boston Consulting Group, for over 100 people for kind of like the same position. And those were like already pre-screened. So what I try to do there is you have your set of questions, you involve them, and you think very hard about which ones differentiate and which ones don't. And I found that the more fluffy the question, the less it differentiates. And also, you must not tell the candidate kind of in any way what actually response you really expect. So there's a fine line between this, obviously, because if you don't give any context, they can't respond properly. But if you give too much, you basically give away the answer. And the question I found the most useful are very concrete questions. First on tech, and also asking them for opinions. So I haven't come across anyone who's good who doesn't have strong opinions on certain techs. So if you just think for like quite junior hiring, we'll ask, oh yeah, what are like all the packages you're using, the libraries, which one's your favorite, and then tell me why, and then tell me like how this differentiates against like another one. And basically in that moment you see if people really thought about it. So I think this is the first one that I really like to use. And the other bits is asking about motivation. Why do people want that job? What do they actually, what would they like about the job? What would be the things that would be not so interesting? Because you find out a lot about what people say and what they don't say, right? So if someone is not talking at all about how they gonna work together with other people, they're probably not crazy collaborative. But you got to ask quite open questions, but also very concrete at the same time. So I think, and then the motivational part is really, really important in my view. I found lots of the fluffy questions very useless.
What's like in your head? What's an example of a fluffy question?
So I think like a fluffy question is just like, oh yeah, what do you think about this general space of data? I think it's too wide, the question, and so you let people go and wander off wherever they want to, and everyone's gonna talk about something completely different. So how do you want to say candidate A did something better than candidate B? You can't, right? And I think also a lot of the like some of the CV specific questions can be not very useful. Like, why did you choose that program over that program? If you think about education, I mean, honestly, people just got in. There's not necessarily that many considerations that people really had, and so they just make stuff up on the fly, I think.
And I imagine these learnings kind of emerged after you'd already done some of these interviews, because then it'll almost become clear what a fluffy question is if everyone's answering it a different way, and you're like, well, all of them are like a 7 out of 10, so it doesn't help me at all. And so this must have been like an iterative process.
Yes, yeah, it was very iterative, right? Like you have to adjust your questions, but that only can happen if you do that interview for the same position again and again. Now I'm doing the same position, more the head of data, head of data science again and again, and you then develop a different set of questions that really help you differentiate. Because I think after 30 minutes, in most cases, you know if the candidate is good or not.
Yeah, it reminds me also of doing technical interviews, and it's not really until you've asked the same question a bunch of times that you even get a sense of what like a good, great, bad, okay answer is. And I remember when I've done like batches of hiring, and I've had a question from the last time I was hiring 6 months ago, and I kind of knew how much a candidate should be scoring on it. And I've had this new batch of candidates, even after if a few of them didn't do that well, I'd be sitting there going, like, is there something I've changed about this question? Like, I'm expecting better. And then the next candidate will come in and bang, 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 knock it out. Go, okay, cool. That's the level we're after. I wasn't losing my mind. But it's hard to know what that is until you've asked it. Funnily enough, I was thinking ChatGPT might be okay at that, like generating answers for questions of a variety of qualities. Like if you've got like a fresh question you've never asked anyone. I've not tried it for that use case, but it might be interesting to kind of generate some data.
Yeah, I think to be honest, I think if we start then recording all those conversations, there's probably a lot of data you could get out of this. Because as we talk about, it's not only about like what is the exact question, like just like how much does it open the space for answers and how much does it let you differentiate people. And I think actually even AI should be able to to give you some kind of idea if you're asking the right questions or if they're not differentiating, particularly if you do like a larger volume of interviews.
Is there anything else, thinking back to that experience, because it's again quite a unique scenario to be interviewing for like the same type of role again and again and again and again with a very high volume? Anything else that sticks out as a particularly interesting learning in kind of interviewing those candidates? Anything jump out as, I don't know, like what differentiated successful from unsuccessful candidates?
I think successful candidates, like first, like we're explaining much more why they're doing things, and we're taking that step back on the issues and saying, okay, let's think what is actually and the bigger picture here. Like even if they have to make it up on the go, right? They would say, okay, yeah, those are the three things I would be maybe looking for in a type of package. Like this one does better on those dimensions and so on, and not just trying to right away jump into the answer. I think that's what good candidates definitely do, taking that step back and explaining why they're doing different things, because there's also a risk, that they have thought about this problem for a really, really long time, and they're just going to tell me exactly the answer, but that's it. And then I don't understand why they gave me that answer. And to be honest, communication is so important that this would be already a problem. I think the second part is actually communication more widely. So always try to score people also generally on communication. And if they are actually being concise, if they are actually answering the question, the worst is people are not answering the questions. Still happens to me. So I think there are a couple of those dimensions you look at where you can like differentiate candidates quite easily.
Yeah, maybe they've watched too many politicians or something, deliberately evading any question they get asked. Yeah, that infuriates me. I got to tell you, if I'm interviewing a candidate and they just don't answer what I've asked them. Think of a few people I've worked with like that are kind of master deflectors, and I'll be sitting there 30 seconds later when they've somehow pivoted the conversation somewhere else. I'm like, hang on, you didn't answer my question at all. Like, it's almost like a magic trick. The ones who are really good at it, it's almost a manipulative way of communicating.
But also really good, right? Like in a work environment, you might need that to some extent. But I think in an interview, like there's a question about, you still have to give people the feeling that you answered the question, even if you didn't.
And I guess at some level, maybe in some roles, like if you're a salesperson, there's maybe some sense of being a bit less direct, is a bit more normal, repositioning everything, always talking in terms of the benefits to the person you're speaking to. There's always some massaging of the truth and the answer that you have to give. So maybe it's a bit role dependent, but yeah, I have to say, in general, if I ask a candidate a question and they give me an answer to some other thing, that's going to grate me pretty quickly.
I completely see that. Yeah, you don't want that to happen. I think the other thing that I'm just now thinking, and maybe that didn't apply in this case, but it applies in like what I'm doing now a lot, is one really is important, the context that you're getting this candidate in, right? Who are actually the other people that are going to work there, and how are they going to work there? Because people are going to work in a team, and so they need to be complementary. And so then you've got to differentiate a little bit your questions and think about how actually are other people in this company working, who exists, how do they see the role, and it has to work as a team. It can't be just you running the show completely alone. That is not the reality, right? And that matters much more for more senior hires than, of course, juniors.
Yeah, so you can't think of them in isolation. You've got to think of them within the context of the team. It's a team sport, as they say. That makes complete sense. Jan, if you could ask our next guest one question about hiring, what question would that be?
Oh, that's a really difficult one to think about. But I think the question you ask about like how does the skill assessment change in the age of AI, I think that's a really intriguing one. I haven't figured it out. I would love for someone to figure it out and tell me how to do it differently, right? But I think that's one of the key questions in my mind.
Yeah, that is a good one, and certainly one I'd be interested in hearing the answer to as well. We'll level that out at a future guest in the not too distant future. Jan, it's been a great conversation today. I've really enjoyed it. We've covered off a lot of different ground, and you've provided some great insights to our audience. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Tim, for having me.